Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. I love a good caper, and this is a story about a great caper.
Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. North America and all the ships at sea. Let's go to press. Flash, Boston. The final figures are now in on the spectacular Brink's robbery. Over $2 million taken by gunmen in a commando-style raid, making it the crime of the century. My sources in the FBI report evidence indicating an inside job, with possible links to organized crime and communist subversives.
Well, it was sort of organized, but not in a mob way, and no communist subversives ever showed up. Still, the caper with the impressive payday is really about how one palooka in South Boston, a small-time thief for most of his life, got his buddies together in 1944, and they, well, mostly it was him, painstakingly cased the offices of Brink's, the armored car people, for 6 years before they perfected a way to steal almost $2.8 million in 1950. To be precise, they took $1,218,211.29 in currency and $1,557,183.83 in checks, money orders, and securities. All of that translates to something like $37 million in today's money, which is a mighty healthy hunk of change, even if you do have to share it with 10 of your friends. Now, I should tell you something here before we get into the gritty details. This story has two versions. One is the official FBI version. It's the one told to them by one of the men who committed the crime and gave up the other 10. The other one is one told to author Noel Bain by 4 of the 6 surviving gang members in 1972 after they had been paroled. The book he wrote, The Big Stick-Up at Brink's, became a bestseller and was the basis for at least 4 movies and a whole bunch of documentary retellings of the heist. The book is supported as well by the 500 documents he got from the FBI, the Boston Police, and the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. But the interesting stuff, the hard work that makes thieving so fascinating, is lacking in the FBI version, which also starts the action a full 2 years after the guys who planned it say it started. Most of the important stuff about the actual crime are the same in both versions. Now I'm going to tell the crew's story because it's a better story, and I suspect it's also far truer. The men, when on trial, remained mute throughout. They didn't even open their mouths to say they were not guilty. They were old school. This is how they rolled. It did take the FBI 6 years and something like $29 million to unravel the heist. That'd be an investigation that would cost $388 million today just to find 11 needles in a very large haystack of possible suspects. That kind of financial outlay equaled a great deal of federal determination to find out who did this, and I'm going to bet my bottom dollar, they wanted to know how. They, of course, weren't the only ones looking. Joining them were the Boston Police Department, the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, the Massachusetts State Police, and Brink's, all throwing in resources and personnel to look high and low for these master criminals. Although, these guys were just plain hoodlums, turns out. Just regular Joe kind of criminals. Guys who were happy to get by shoplifting, forging checks, taking coats from Filene's basement and refrigerators from Sears. They were small time, until they weren't. It all began in 1944 when ex-con and local boy Tony Pino was casing a camera shop on his way home from his night job stocking snack trucks that delivered to convenience stores. While he waited for the train to take him home, he would wander the area and see what easy scores might be waiting for him in plain sight. As he walked, he would take different routes, stopping occasionally to tie his shoes so he could linger in a doorway or sit on a bench and eat a sandwich he'd packed for just this reason, or check a door to see if it was locked, watching all the time who was where on the street and what the regular routines were, if there were any. This was second nature to the big man who believed that if you put it in front of him, he was invited to take it. Born in Italy, but soon brought to this country, Pino was poor in an age, explained Noel Bain in Big Stick-Up at Brink's, quote, when finding or stealing coal to feed the ever-hungry pot-bellied kitchen stove was considered a routine duty for children, end quote. Especially in the Italian and Irish families that already had too many mouths to feed. The coal pinching was something Pino excelled at, even when he was just 6. He moved on from coal, though he could be caught. By the time he was 15, he'd been arrested 8 times, been through 3 probations, and spent 7 years in a reformatory for taking $20. He'd even been shot in the butt and thigh during a police raid that had been prompted by a small theft of milk and cake. Boston was a tough little town in the 20s and 30s. A nonstop talker and a man who would rather lie than bother with the truth, Pino was known as a good caseman. That is, a guy who could spend innumerable days and nights casing a place to get the full lay of the land. He excelled at organizing heists, thinking through all the angles, drilling those he brought in, and typically running a tight ship. He would have made a great pirate. He was also known to have at least 3 Boston cops in his hip pocket, though he was not considered a big-time anything. Some Boston cops had never heard of him. Same was true of the cop reporters for the Boston newspapers, who knew most everybody. But he managed. Always had some kind of real job for appearance's sake, but never really figured that was where the money was. He made his own way, which wasn't always easy because he was in this country illegally. During most of the Second World War, he was serving time in Massachusetts' Charlestown State Prison, managing side jobs while inside, like running a laundry service and selling cigarettes and candy that were smuggled in for ready cash. When he got out, he swore to himself that he would only steal if he needed to eat or if he needed the money to pay a lawyer to fight his deportation. I suspect this was another of his lies to himself. He just wasn't good at going straight. But his girlfriend didn't allow anything in the house that she knew was stolen, which meant that Pino had to falsify some receipts for her to see sometimes. That was easy enough. Had to keep her happy. Here's Stephanie Scoro, a Boston Herald reporter who wrote Crime of the Century, How the Brinks Robbers Stole Millions and the Hearts of Boston, talking about Tony Pino.
He was, by all accounts, a very kind of a strange fellow. He was a jovial man. He could tell stories that would just keep you riveted, make you laugh. They had a kind of a sinister side to him. He was very overweight, but he was also a master disguise.
So like I was saying, one day in 1944, he was casing this camera shop and was veering through the Boston streets very early in the morning. Casework took time, but he had it. Didn't want to look obvious or suspicious, didn't want to be remembered by anyone. That explained why he never took the same route twice. On this one day, Pino explored a new way to the camera shop when he walked by the rear of the Chamber of Commerce building on Federal Street and saw a parked armored truck in an unlit parking lot near the doors of the facility. Inside, he saw that the lights were on and the marble floors gleamed. Outside, a guy in a gray uniform casually leaned against the wall. Propped beside him was what looked like a shotgun. Pino hid in the shadows, only to watch two men carry out a metal box on wheels to the safety of the truck. The three guys put the box in the truck, locked nothing that Pino could see, got in, and roared off. Pino watched long enough to see the squared-off truck pass under a streetlight. The sign on the truck read, Brink's. Interesting. From a documentary called Great Crimes and Trials of the 20th Century.
Brink's was a company which collected cash from banks and then counted out and delivered payrolls. Each evening, the next day's deliveries would all be sorted and counted. Overnight, they would be locked in what Brink's boasted was an impenetrable vault.
Pino, about to wander on, saw a second armored car approach. Same deal. Into the side street, into the unlit parking lot, cozying up to the curb at the building's back doors. Then another. Guards brought out bags of money, put them in the trucks, and roared off, over and over. "Mother of God," he told biographer Bain. These are direct quotes, don't come at me for the grammar. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There were all them money trucks standing there, and once they started loading, I knew they was mine. I damn near shouted, 'Hey, you fellas, go easy with that merchandise. It belongs to me.'" His biggest concern at the time? He had no one to tell. That would change. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Uncommon Goods. We just had a birthday in this here household, and most of the gifts I gave Scott were awesome items from Uncommon Goods. I mean, I love this shop. I get absolutely lost in the site because there's so much fun stuff to peruse there. With the holiday season officially here, why not head over to check out the incredible hand-picked gift options available at Uncommon Goods. Whether you're shopping for your Secret Santa or your entire family, Uncommon Goods knows exactly what they want. Uncommon Goods looks for products that are high quality, unique, and often handmade or made in the U.S. They have these meaningful, out-of-the-ordinary gifts that feel personalized. Plus, some of them you actually can personalize. I'd tell you some of the gifts I'm getting people for Christmas, but then I'd have to forbid my friends and relatives from listening, so I'll just tell you this. I got these little watering IV bags for my plants that are so adorable, and they work really well too. Plus, with every purchase you make at Uncommon Goods, they give back $1 to a nonprofit partner of your choice. They've donated more than $3 million to date. To get 15% off your next gift, go to uncommongoods.com/COTC. That's uncommongoods.com/COTC for 15% off. Don't miss this limited time offer. Uncommon Goods. We're all out of the ordinary. A friend who Tony Pino had spent time committing crimes with and serving time with, Sandy Richardson, was the first call he made. Richardson, an experienced safecracker, wasn't supposed to be mingling with Pino. You know how those on probation aren't supposed to fraternize with ex-cons or other assorted bad boys? But there they were, on an early morning walk through Boston, so Richardson could see the astonishing lack of security around what looked like the HQ of the nation's preeminent guardian of move-around money. While Pino was busy figuring out how most of the money was coming straight out of the Federal Reserve Bank and into Brink's hands to be distributed to various companies to do an assortment of jobs on the debit side of the ledger, like for supplies and for payroll, Richardson was figuring that it would take a lot more than just he and Pino to handle this hit. They needed more manpower and equipment for the job. Okay, they needed a crew, which could be assembled easily enough. So over the following months, Pino and Richardson swore some guys they trusted to secrecy and laid out the intended target. A few new names were dragged in, which made them nervous, but they had certain skills that were needed. Another, Jimmy Costas, was Pino's brother-in-law. Family, you know, gotta cut them in. Stephanie Scoro again.
These were all kind of minor thieves that had records. They knew each other from prison. There was a total of 9 men in all, including a guy named Stanley Gashora, who was the youngest member of the gang, very much beloved by everybody. And then also he gathered this guy named Jazz Maffey, who was the respectable member of the crew. He was a bookie, a respectable calling in those days, and he was very tall, very handsome.
Maffey was also game to help with the actual stick-up. On that front, Pino and Richardson argued over whether it should be a burglary, in, out while no one there, or an armed robbery where they'd have to flash a gun and tie people up. Richardson didn't want the guns. Pino saw no other way. More men were recruited.
William McGinnis, a barkeeper, was brought in to launder the money, because one of the issues with taking out so much money is that you'd have to somehow launder it in some way that doesn't raise suspicion.
Now came the real work. Days upon days of timing the trucks, determining which number truck took money on which day and to where. They shadowed guards, figuring out which was the most vulnerable. They checked for cracks that could be exploited. Days became months. Pino lost his snack truck job, where he had spent months amassing just $600 in legit pay. Meanwhile, he told Arthur Bain that, in the same time frame, he'd made $6,000 the old-fashioned way, by taking it from others. Now, $5,000 of that was to get him made a legal American citizen, or at least get the immigration people off his back, because they still wanted to deport the ex-con that he was. The money was mostly for bribes. Apparently, that usually worked in Boston. Pino now set himself up in an apartment across the street from the Chamber building, watching the goings-on through binoculars, taking notes, urinating in a milk bottle so he wouldn't miss anything. But they were not ready to take Brinks. They could have easily chosen to take individual trucks, but those were small time. They wanted the big prize. Patience, Pino preached. Still, he and everyone else on the crew was now doing a lot of cracking of small safes. The take was usually a tad more than $5,000 apiece, sometimes more. Because they had to make a living. Then things got busy, winter came, spring came. Then President Franklin Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, and the crew stopped working. Like Bain writes, quote, out of grief or shame or respect, end quote. Then they started up again, not bothering to stop for VE Day or VJ Day. Pino, the great caseman, would sometimes do a bit of freelance casing, planning the details of a theft, then selling the plan to Joe McGinnis, a known snitch, but somebody Pino loved, who would run it by some gangs. Pino usually took a cut of the take. Organized crime in the truest sense. These guys were plenty organized, but they weren't killing people or being violent, not really. They just liked taking things. But one night in mid-January, while Pino's busy casing a mansion in Cambridge, he saw a Brink's truck pulling into a side street, parking in front of a garage building. He circled around a bit, came back to find the truck gone, but peeked into the garage. Turned out this was where the company parked the cars when not in use. And Pino saw something else, a board where the keys to all the trucks hung. Holy shit. Plans were changed. The decision was made to start robbing Brinks. Trucks, that is. They already knew a lot about their routes. One truck Pino had been following for a year. The guards would pick up bags of money, drop some off at one location, and move on to the next, but not before stopping every Thursday morning at a diner for a cup of coffee, maybe some breakfast. On its way to a much larger delivery of cash, the truck sat locked for the duration of the stop, sometimes as long as 40 minutes. So, one day in February 1946, Pino and Richardson put up a temporary work construction blinder around the car after it was parked and locked, used duplicate keys that Pino had made from those he'd found at the garage, and casually took what was inside. It was a disappointing haul, just $3,500, but here's what they learned. Brinks didn't report the robbery, and their routes, safety procedures, and personnel didn't change at all. The next step. Richardson wanted to crack a few safes in the businesses just after Brinks had dropped the money. The amounts were small, each individually not more than $10,000. This continued for 2 years, with the men having snatched around $400,000 from Brinks' customers and another $350 to $400,000 from Brinks' parked trucks, for which they now had every key. The funny thing was nobody, no cops, no private eyes, no one, connected the first group of heists with the fact that they had all just been serviced by Brinks, and the truck takes didn't seem to be reported too often to the cops, because Brinks likely found it easier to replace that cash than suffer the public relations disaster that loomed if anyone had taken notice. Good fun, for sure, but Pino's crew wanted to know, when were they going to do the big one? Lots of times, Pino would be accused of overthinking things and over-preparing for every eventuality. He'd be accused of having too many crew meetings at his apartment to discuss even the most minute details. He worried the details to death. For example, Jimmy Faherty, one of the crew, had read that armored cars now had this newfangled radio-controlled communication capability that kept them in contact with a home base. Pino spent many weeks following a lot of Brink's cars through Boston and the surrounding communities checking for antennae, something that Faherty had said was needed if the trucks were going to be outfitted with that special equipment. Pino never spotted an antenna. Check. Others in the crew could be just as meticulous and pretty crafty. When Sandy Richardson was assigned the job of finding out how much was in the General Electric payroll bag that went out on a regular basis via Brink's truck, he followed a guy into a bar near the GE plant and watched him get a bit tipsy. Then, wearing a pea coat and knit hat he had from his days in the Merchant Marine, he bellied his way up next to him and struck up a conversation. The guy noticed his gear and offered to buy the sailor a drink, and they got to chattering. Soon enough, the guy, who had had a lot to drink, began yelling to other coworkers in the bar to get his facts straight. And just like that, Richardson knew exactly how many people worked in the GE plant, the average pay per person, and what time they got paid. Once they did the math on the 26,000 people who worked there, each making close to $100 a week, well, it was better than the $2 million that Brinks dropped at the GE paymaster on a weekly basis. This was not a game for amateurs. Then, because the best laid plans can go awry, they did. First, Pino and one of his cohorts got caught stealing a dozen golf balls. They had done it on a whim, just the usual shoplifting kind of thing. Pino was found guilty, but everyone figured they'd pull off the huge Brinks job before he was sentenced. After all, it'd been years in the making. All the preliminary work had been done. All the costumes, mostly maintenance whites picked up at various bakeries and construction sites, had been procured, as well as the Halloween masks, most from superhero shops at various arcades. They had overly prepared, continuing their running discussions about when to strike and who would do what. Then they practiced it over and over. Pino and Richardson had already been in and out of the building, in and out of the vault area, 15 times without setting off any alarms. They marveled anew at how badly this money was protected. Pino, a large man, wiggled himself through the smallest spaces without getting stuck. It seemed like they had done all they could do to prep. The big break-in was set for January 7th, 1949. The men were dressed and had their orders. They drove to the Brink's office there in the Chamber of Commerce building. Then something really odd happened. The men were dropped off at the site and had all their backup trucks in position, one to drop off the thieves, another for getaway, a third to thwart any attempt at pursuit by law enforcement. But nothing looked as it should. Brink's had straight up disappeared from the location. The crew was baffled. Something was terribly amiss. Had their big score been revealed to the cops? Were they all about to be tossed in the clink? None of the above. Brink's had simply decided to move from Federal Street to 165 Prince Street in Boston. This was done December 6, 1948, the same day Pino had been busy facing arraignment for lifting those golf balls. The crew had to start all over. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by laundry sauce. Laundry is a ritual we all do, and laundry sauce has made that ritual so much better. Laundry sauce is the world's best-smelling laundry detergent, and it comes in simple-to-use, high-performance pods that you just drop in with your clothes, and the next thing you know, you have luxurious-smelling laundry that will make you feel like a pampered celebrity, even if you aren't one. My scent of choice is Egyptian rose, but there's more to like about laundry sauce than how it smells, and that includes the fact that it doesn't come in one of those big plastic jugs that just ends up in a landfill. Plus, laundry sauce isn't just detergent pods, it's also scent boosters, dryer sheets, dryer balls, and fabric softeners too. Laundry sauce has some of the funniest, most authentic reviews you'll ever read. Like this one from Tim, who said, quote, "It's like being transported to a land of bliss," end quote. Now is the time to elevate your laundry day with the laundry sauce. Head to laundrysauce.com/COTC and use promo code COTC at checkout for 15% off. That's the best offer you'll find, but you must use my code COTC for 15% off your order. One last time, that's laundrysauce.com/COTC, promo code COTC for 15% off. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Miracle Made. Miracle Made sheets are great because they're super duper comfortable, but that's not all. Miracle Made offers a whole line of self-cleaning antibacterial bedding that prevent up to 99.7% of bacterial growth and require up to 3 times less laundering. But here's what I love most about them. They have temperature regulating properties for better quality sleep. By using silver-infused fabrics inspired by NASA, they're designed to keep you the perfect temperature all night long, no matter the weather. Let me tell you, they work. I haven't woken up drenched in my own sweat in months. Sorry, humans are gross, y'all. At least you don't have to feel gross, though, with Miracle Made sheets. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code COTC at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC and use the code COTC to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40% off. Again, that's trymiracle.com/COTC to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. After the thwarted robbery attempt on January 7th, 1949, Tony Pino and his crew first had to figure out where Brink's had moved to. They figured they just had to pick up a truck on its route, one they had followed dozens of times now, and just follow it. Pino had to climb walls, skitter over fences, duck through small openings, run through playgrounds, and wait interminably to get the lay of the land in the new North Boston location. But he had done it before, and he would do it again if it meant landing this big fish. When Pino got in, he saw everything from the actual vault to the clipboard, which detailed what money was in the vault at any given time. Stephanie Scoro again.
He would go in, pull the lock cylinder out of a door, put in a dummy cylinder, rush to a key shop, get a key made for the cylinder, rush back, and surreptitiously put the entire lock cylinder back into the door. And he did this for a series of doors.
He estimated now that the Brink's vault had held $6 million on certain days. One of those days would be the day they would take it. Meanwhile, word was spreading outside of the crew that Pino was planning something huge. Lots of folks on the fringes of the crew wanted in, which caused the already initiated to begin arguing amongst themselves about who was trustworthy enough to be brought in. So in came an old favorite of Pino's, Joe McGinnis. Again, well-connected, knew the ropes, had a way with the cops. Much later, the FBI would give McGinnis most of the credit for being the mastermind behind the Brink's robbery, but no one who really knew him gave him more than a minor role. Also in, Joseph James O'Keefe, known to everyone simply as Specs. A skinny guy with a sketchy past, he wasn't exactly considered a stand-up fella. He left his wife and kid for a sex worker and was known to do drugs, something the others weren't fond of. But he had an interesting backstory. The first time he was arrested, he was just 6 years old. With him that day, also arrested, was 6-year-old Tony Pino. So yeah, they went way back. Speck's record was a bit long. 33 arrests and 21 convictions over 35 years, mostly for breaking and entering, larceny, armed robbery, assault, and possession of burglar's tools. The crew already on board argued he wasn't big enough for this job, but he got in to do random small jobs. Now, the biggest obstacle to setting a date for the heist was figuring out how to get around Brink's new ADT alarm. So the men decided to break into ADT's executive offices to see if they could find information on what kind of alarm was installed there. 2 guys agreed to do it and returned to the assembled masses to explain that they entered the building, read the building directory, went to the 3rd floor, found a file drawer marked B, and found a folder titled Brink's, Commercial Street, and took it. The find showed that Brink's was insured for $5 million, and that Brink's thought their bill of less than $20 a month for that alarm system was exorbitant. The crew also discovered the name of the security system. Armed with that, a crew member was dispatched to MIT to get some guy to go to the patent office in D.C. and find what the alarm was and did and how it could be disarmed. The next day, they returned the Brink's file to the ADT offices. I love this kind of detail because people think crime is so easy. This one really wasn't. Now, you might be wondering about what happened to Tony Pino's deportation order, which had been based on him being undesirable because he'd been convicted of 2 crimes, which required at least 1 year in prison. Well, on September 9th, 1949, after putting money into the right hands, he received official pardons for 2 crimes he had served 2 concurrent sentences of 6 years for. Now, he only had 1 conviction on the books. Voila, he could stay. Pino was left to worry about other things. Specifically, he tried to make sense of the light in a 5th floor window immediately next to the room where the Brink's vault was located. It went out every night, but the timing was unpredictable. Sometimes it was as early as 7:15 p.m., sometimes as late as 8:40 p.m. How was a man supposed to plan a robbery here if nobody stuck to a routine? Pino figured that light coincided with the arming of the alarm, so he decided to schedule the robbery for early evening before any alarms could be set. The guns had been acquired. It had all been rehearsed. Signals had been agreed upon. The most important code word they would pass to one another was this: Paul Revere is off. The rest was unspoken. They were off and running. Now all that was left was for Pino to explain explicitly how those who pulled off this kind of haul behaved so they didn't get caught. Plan your alibi. Don't buy anything. Don't carry any more money in your wallet than you usually do. Don't talk, not even among yourselves. The crewmates agreed. They would all stay out of trouble and stash the money somewhere out of reach for 6 years, which, not coincidentally, was precisely when the statute of limitations would expire. On January 17, 1950, the weather across the nation was exceptionally crappy. But most of them knew that if it wasn't today, it would be tomorrow, and if not tomorrow, the next day, because it was time. The tick-tock of practice maneuvers began around noon that day. Hours later, 7 costumed, masked, and armed men were standing in front of a gated door that led to the money. They subdued 5 employees who were forced to lie face down with their arms behind their backs. The men lashed the employees together, placed adhesive tape over their mouths, and removed glasses from the faces of those who wore them. Then, the robbing began. The crew, sweating behind their masks, tore open envelopes of payroll cash, filled their stolen laundry bags, loaded up carts, ran the carts to the stairs, where they were rushed down the steps. A metal box, which everyone knew was supposed to contain $1 million, resisted being opened. Sandy, the great safecracker, could not crack it. Lord knows he tried. The gang was inside the building for 20 minutes. They were scheduled to stay not a minute longer. This meant, of course, that millions would be left behind. Alas. When the signal was given, the doors to the building opened, and in 25 seconds, everything they had taken was thrown into the waiting truck. Tony Pino threw a fit about the metal box being left behind. He raged at Richardson, quote, "If you hadn't just stolen more goddamn money than anybody in the world, I'd kill you with my bare hands for leaving that metal box behind," end quote. Then everyone got into their assigned cars and slowly and carefully moved into traffic and were gone. There were witnesses, but not very good ones. Here's an employee talking to a news program back in the day.
And then I heard them going in the vault. I heard bags being tipped over and ripping open pay envelopes.
It was just past 7 when Pino was dropped off at his apartment. From there, he planned to go straight to his attorney's house for alibi purposes. Quote, "So I walk around the corner instead of using the alley. I want everyone else in the world to see me. I start up to Joe's Package liquor store, that's owned by co-conspirator Joe McGinnis, and mother of God, I couldn't believe it. There was Joe standing out in front, big as life, talking to Lieutenant Crowley. Okay, I stop and say hello to them and ask Joe if I can have credit for a couple of bottles of Metaxas brand. You always want to ask for something people is going to remember. I ask Joe what time it is. If I asked the time, that meant the job come off," end quote. At 7:27, the Brink's employees managed to get free enough to call for help. By 7:45, cops had sufficiently swarmed the building, and reporters were on their way. By 8, all the bridges to Boston had been closed. Ditto for bus and train terminals. The feds were on scene a half hour later. By 10, everyone on the eastern seaboard knew. The original take was given to be $1 million in cash and half that much in securities. That number would rise, of course. According to Tony Pino, the next morning he knew he'd be brought in as a suspicious person forced probably to strip to his skivvies to prove he wasn't their guy. And then he noticed he needed new underwear for that. So he went to Filene's basement and stole some.
Christine Heron was 15 years old in the spring of 1993 when she disappeared, and in over 30 years there has been no trace of her.
I did know before the night was over she was dead, though.
A story of murder and heartbreak and investigative error.
He was 90% sure he was going to be convicted.
From CBC Podcasts, I'm David Ridgen, and this is Someone Knows Something, Season 9, The Christine Heron Case. Available now.
Let's just say the Brink's heist made a splash across the nation. Headlines the size of those announcing war were used by newspapers to impart the details of the theft, because it was all so tantalizing and, well, cool. Scoro again.
Nobody was hurt. That's a key element of this. They got in, got out, no one was hurt, no one was roughed up, clean getaway. Why do we like Ocean's 11's movies? It's because the idea is that you do this heist, you get away with it, no one's hurt, it's quick, it's slick.
A whole wagon full of money and securities were gone. And so was the crew. Left behind were some rope, a roll of waterproof adhesive tape, and a chauffeur's hat. If you don't count the eyewitnesses who saw 5 gloved men in latex Captain Marvel masks who barely spoke as they went about their business. In a Boston Post extra edition, the 3-deck head read, 9 gunmen seize over $1 million in cash in hub holdup. The Boston Herald extra read, 9 bandits steal $1.5 million, leave another $1 million at Brink's. Biggest robbery in U.S. history.
It was called the crime of the century, and basically what people woke up to or heard about that evening was that 7 or 9, they weren't even sure at first, masked men had broken into the headquarters of the Brinks on the north end of Boston. Now, the thing about the Brinks, you have to understand the Brinks was this well-known armored truck company that moved money all through the city. At that time, Boston was a cash society. So when you got paid, your paycheck, it was in cash.
Right.
So the idea that the Brinks, which was considered the premier place to stash your money or move it, was broken into, first of that was really amazing. But the idea was these masked men got into the Brinks headquarters and in the matter of 15 to 20 minutes or less managed to make out with millions of dollars.
The money was already safely ensconced in the home of Jazz Maffey's parents in the Mission Hill section of Boston. From a documentary titled Great Crimes and Trials of the 20th Century.
At a press conference, Brink's officials announced that they would pay a reward of $100,000. But despite this massive prize, there was silence from the underworld. The FBI staged and photographed its own reconstruction.
Tips and suggestions poured in from the public. Most the FBI had already considered. They looked first at the Boston mob. Then they spread the net wider to include known thieves around the country. Everybody had to account for their whereabouts for the mid-January time period. Most of the guys who had actually done the deed were brought in, then cleared, more or less. The FBI and Boston police then went to prisons to talk to inmates about what they had heard. They went to Vegas, to racetracks, to backstreet gambling houses to see if anyone had been dropping fresh sums of cash. Of course, they also talked to anyone who had ever worked for Brink's, as well as any customers of the firm, any letter carriers or message services that delivered there. You know, anyone who might know the layout of the joint. Customers were asked to supply any description or info they had on what had been stolen, the type of packaging and shipping material used, the brand of wrapper used on the bills, and they prayed, surely somebody had serial numbers. Some guy on the street near the Brink's offices reported seeing a 1949 green Ford truck with a canvas top parked near the door of the Brink's around the time the robbery was going down. 6 or 7 weeks later, pieces of that truck were found detached, smashed, and randomly bagged in a dump in nearby Stoughton. The truck had been stolen in early November from a dealership near Fenway Park. The bags the parts were in got the full FBI treatment and were found to have been used as beef bone containers originating in South America and sent to a gelatin manufacturer in Massachusetts. Really fine investigative work that led exactly nowhere. Now, the totals I gave you early on in the story were, in truth, just very specific guesses, because so many of the things taken that evening were sealed packages. Even Brink's didn't know how much the robbers got away with. Neither did the robbers. The feds, as I said, spent gobs of cash, 10 times the amount taken in the robbery, trying to finger the guys who had pulled off what some were already calling the crime of the century. Things got messy and weird. A grand jury even indicted a Boston Irish gang using some of the actual thieves as witnesses. Then Speck O'Keefe, whom the FBI had been watching, decided he needed to get out of town. He and a friend left the state, and because it's what they do, they committed an armed robbery to get the cash to keep going. They got dinged and were sent to prison. This caused consternation with the Brink's crew.
But when he was released in February 1954, he discovered that he had been cheated out of $67,000. Back in Boston, he threatened to spill the beans and was stalked round the city by a hitman with a machine gun, imported from New York. And after 2 near-fatal attacks, he gave up on his erstwhile friends and made a deal. He told the FBI how it was done and who to look for. They went public.
I appeal to the decent men and women of the United States to assist the FBI and all other law enforcement agencies.
His former crewmates had known that he was under a lot of pressure to talk, and they were confident he would give it all up. So, yeah, they were the ones who had sent the New York hitman to kill him. They were just too close to getting away with it. 11 days before the statute of limitations was set to expire, Speck folded. He talked. The men who broke Brink's were indicted on 108 counts. Bail was set at a whopping $120,000 each. Boston was a tad ambivalent about these guys. They had captured the imaginations of a ton of people, and some downright admired the cojones it took to pull this heist off. This was so much of a problem for the case that 798 jurors were dismissed before the judge could seat a single one. Pino, Richardson, and the main players got life sentences for armed robbery, with some years added on for breaking and entering at night and for conspiracy to steal. McGinnis, who must have had a hell of a record, got 8 life sentences for being an accessory. Speck O'Keefe received concurrent sentences of 3 to 4 years on 3 counts of armed robbery, 3 to 4 years for breaking and entering with intent to commit a felony, and 3 to 4 years for, and I love this, violation of general laws. They were all sent to Walpole Prison. Their story remains fodder for screenplays and documentaries. To date, at least 4 movies have been made based on the robbery. The most remembered is The Brink's Job, directed by William Friedkin, who also directed The French Connection and The Exorcist. Speck got out in 1960, went west, served as a chauffeur to Cary Grant of all people, and was said to have regretted ratting out his friends. Variously, the main players were paroled in 1967, 1969, 1970, and 1971. On October 4th, 1973, Tony Pino told author Bain that he was still intent on killing Speck O'Keefe. At 2 a.m. the following day, Tony Pino died of a heart attack. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read The Big Stick Up at Brink's by Noel Bain and Stephanie Scoro's Crime of the Century, How the Brink's Robbers Stole Millions and the Hearts of Boston. She also watched a bunch of documentaries, scanned a lot of newspapers from the era, and saw a few bad movies based on the robbery. Still, it was fun. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.